The lunch rush had already passed. The diner was quiet in that in-between hour when conversations thin out and the air feels still. Steven sat alone in a corner booth, shoulders squared, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. He wasn't reading. He wasn't on his phone. He was just sitting there, staring at the reflection of the window across from him. The bell above the door rang softly. No one looked up. A few seconds later, there was a slow, uneven sound against the tile floor. Not loud, just steady. A shoe, dragging slightly between steps. Steven noticed it before he saw who it belonged to. An elderly man moved carefully between the tables. He leaned heavily on a worn cane. One leg lagged behind the other, stiff and uncooperative. His jacket hung loosely over narrow shoulders and his breathing seemed measured like every step required calculation. He stopped beside Steven's booth. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The old man's hand tightened around the cane handle. His other hand rested lightly on the edge of the table, not demanding space and just asking for balance. His voice, when it came, was low but steady. "Can I sit with you?" It wasn't rushed. It wasn't desperate. It sounded like a genuine question, not a favor. Steven looked up slowly. Most people would have waved him off politely. A quiet shake of the head. An excuse. Privacy is easy to protect when you're used to being recognized. But something about the man's expression held his attention. There was no recognition in his eyes. No excitement. No agenda. Just patience. Steven studied him for a long second. The limp. The tired lines across his face. The way he stood without apology. Then, without speaking, Steven nodded toward the empty seat across from him. The old man lowered himself carefully into the booth, exhaling as he settled in. The cane rested against the table. His hands lay flat, in front of him, fingers slightly trembling, though he tried to still them. Silence stretched between them. Not awkward. Not yet. Just two strangers sitting across from each other, separated by a table, and by lives neither one understood. Outside, a car passed. Inside, something small had already shifted. For a few seconds, they simply sat there. The waitress approached, glanced at Steven, then at the elderly man, and poured him a cup of coffee without asking questions. The old man thanked her softly, both hands wrapped around the mug as if drawing warmth from it. Steven waited. He had agreed to the seat. That didn't mean he owed conversation. The old man looked around the diner first, almost studying the room, then finally met Steven's eyes. "I won't take much of your time," he said calmly. "I just didn't feel like sitting alone today." It was honest, plain, no hidden tone. Steven gave a short nod. "That's fine." Another pause. Then the old man surprised him. "You're quieter in person," he said. "That's good." Steven's brow shifted slightly. "You know who I am?" The man gave a faint smile. "I know enough." He didn't mention movies, didn't mention headlines, didn't compliment him. Instead, he leaned back carefully and continued. "I've seen people surround you before. Cameras, noise, everyone wanting something." He tapped a finger lightly on the table. "Today you're just sitting." Steven didn't answer right away. He wasn't used to being observed, without being praised or criticized. The old man took a slow sip of coffee. "I used to be strong," he said matter-of-factly. "Stronger than most men in this room. Worked with my hands, built things, fixed things. People came to me when something broke." He flexed his fingers unconsciously, as if remembering the weight they once carried. Then one winter morning, my body decided it had other plans. No drama. No bitterness. Just acceptance. Steven listened. The man continued. "When you lose strength slowly, it teaches you things. When you lose it suddenly, it teaches you faster." Steven felt that line settle between them. "What did it teach you?" he asked, almost without thinking. The old man smiled faintly. "That pride can be heavier than steel." He looked down at his leg briefly. I spent months refusing help, told myself I could still do everything alone, fell more times than I'd admit. He gave a soft breath that could have been a laugh. Turns out, the hardest thing isn't lifting weight. It's letting someone else carry it. Steven shifted slightly in his seat. The conversation wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was direct. "You don't look like a man who asks for help easily," the old man added, studying him again. Steven's jaw tightened slightly. "I manage." The man nodded slowly. "That's what I used to say." Silence returned, but it felt different now. Less empty. More reflective. Outside, light shifted across the windows. Inside, 2 cups of coffee sat half-finished. The old man didn't press further. He didn't preach. He simply sat there, present, as if the act of sharing was enough. And for reasons Steven couldn't fully explain, he found himself listening more closely than he had intended. The old man didn't rush his story. He spoke in pieces, like someone sorting through a box of memories he hadn't opened in a while. "I had a family once that filled every room," he said quietly. "Loud dinners, arguments about nothing, grandkids running through the house." His eyes softened, but he didn't look away. "When I got hurt, I thought they needed me to stay the same, strong, unbreakable, so I pretended." Steven listened without interrupting. "I hid the pain," the man continued. "Snapped at people when they tried to help. Pushed them away because I didn't want them seeing me struggle." He wrapped his fingers tighter around the coffee cup, knuckles pale for a moment. "You ever notice how easy it is to protect your image? And how hard it is to protect your relationships?" Steven shifted in his seat. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The old man gave a faint nod, like he understood the silence. "My son stopped visiting as much," he went on. "Not because he didn't care, because I wouldn't let him see me weak. I thought I was preserving respect." He paused, eyes steady. "All I did was build distance." The words didn't sound rehearsed. They sounded lived in. Steven felt something, uncomfortable stir in his chest. Strength had always been a currency in his world. Control. Composure. Certainty. People expected it from him. He expected it from himself. "You know what surprised me?" the man said softly. "The day I finally let someone help me stand, I didn't feel smaller. I felt relieved." Steven's gaze lifted. "I thought asking for help would strip something away. Instead, it gave something back. A quiet settled between them again, the kind that doesn't demand filling." The old man leaned back carefully against the booth. "For years I believed being strong meant carrying everything alone," he added. "But strength without connection becomes isolation." He studied Steven's expression for a moment, not judging, not prying, just observing. "You don't look like a man who isolates by accident," he said gently. Steven's jaw tightened slightly, though he kept his voice even. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," the old man replied calmly, "some of us build walls so well we forget they're there." The statement wasn't an accusation. It felt more like recognition. Steven stared at the table for a second, watching a faint ring of condensation form beneath his cup. The old man didn't smile this time. "When my wife passed," he continued quietly, "I didn't cry in front of anyone. I handled paperwork, arranged everything, stayed composed." His voice thinned just slightly. "I told myself that's what a strong man does." He looked up again. "But grief doesn't disappear just because you manage it well." Steven inhaled slowly. The diner around them felt farther away now. Conversations blurred into background noise. "I learned something too late," the man said. "People don't connect to perfection. They connect to honesty." Steven finally spoke, his voice lower than before. "And what if honesty feels like exposure?" The old man held his gaze. "Then maybe exposure is the price of being seen." That landed heavier than anything else. No dramatic music, no raised voices. Just a simple exchange that cut deeper than expected. The old man glanced at the clock on the wall, then back at Steven. "I didn't ask to sit here to lecture you," he said evenly. "I asked because sometimes it helps to sit across from someone who understands pressure. He reached into his jacket pocket slowly and pulled out his wallet. From it, he removed a small folded receipt. He placed it on the table between them but didn't slide it forward yet. For a long time, he added quietly, I believed change only comes from big events. Accidents. Loss. Crisis. His fingers rested lightly on the paper. Turns out sometimes it starts with a conversation you didn't plan on having. Steven looked at the folded receipt but didn't touch it. The weight in the booth had shifted. Not heavier, clearer. The old man finally slid the receipt toward him. You'll understand tomorrow, he said. No explanation followed. He simply reached for his cane, stood carefully, and adjusted his balance before stepping away. Steven watched him cross the diner slowly, the uneven rhythm of his walk steady but deliberate. The doorbell rang, again as he left. Steven remained seated, staring at the folded piece of paper on the table. The words lingered longer than the man did, and for the first time in a long while, silence didn't feel controlled. It felt uncertain. Steven didn't open the folded receipt right away. He left it on the table for several minutes after the old man walked out. The diner slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm. Plates clinking, low conversations, the hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. But the booth no longer felt ordinary. He picked up the paper eventually, turning it over once in his hands before unfolding it. An address, a time, no name, no explanation, just that. He stared at it longer than necessary, as if more words might appear if he waited. They didn't. By the time he stepped outside, the air had cooled. The sun was lower, stretching shadows across the pavement. He slid into his car and placed the receipt on the passenger seat beside him. He told himself it meant nothing, just an old man trying to feel important, just a harmless invitation. He started the engine, yet the entire drive home felt unusually quiet. That night, the house was still, the kind of stillness that amplifies thought. Steven placed the receipt on his desk in his study. He stood there for a moment, staring at it again. An address, a time. He had dealt with complex negotiations, high-pressure decisions, unpredictable situations. He was not a man unsettled by mystery, and yet this, simple, vague, unremarkable, bothered him more than it should have. He loosened his collar and sat down in his chair. Why tomorrow? Why not explain it in the diner? Why him? The questions weren't loud, but they refused to leave. He leaned back and closed his eyes briefly, replaying the conversation in his head. The old man's voice had been steady. No manipulation, no desperation, no sales pitch, just presence. Steven opened his eyes and reached for the receipt again. He flipped it over, as if checking for something hidden in the blank space. Nothing. He set it back down. Hours passed. He tried reading. The words blurred. He turned. On the television, turned it off again within minutes. He poured himself a drink and let it sit untouched. The quiet pressed in. The old man's statement echoed louder now than it had in the diner. Sometimes exposure is the price of being seen. Steven exhaled slowly. He had built his life on discipline, control, predictability. He did not attend unknown meetings at undisclosed locations simply because a stranger suggested it, and yet something about ignoring it felt heavier than showing up. He walked to the window and looked out at the darkened street. His reflection stared back at him in the glass. Strong posture, composed expression, no visible cracks. But the conversation had unsettled something internal. The old man had spoken about distance as if he recognized it immediately, as if he had once lived inside it. Steven crossed his arms, thinking. What unsettled him wasn't fear. It was recognition. He had seen himself reflected in someone who had already walked further down that road. He didn't like that. Midnight passed. He went upstairs but didn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle. The address kept resurfacing in his mind. He imagined arriving and finding nothing, a closed building, an empty lot. He imagined walking into something awkward, something unnecessary. He imagined ignoring it completely and wondering for weeks what he had missed. That last thought bothered him most. He turned onto his side and let out a quiet breath. It wasn't about curiosity anymore. It was about choice. Avoid the unknown, or step into it. By 3 a.m., he gave up trying to sleep. He went back downstairs, poured a glass of water, and sat at the kitchen table in the dim light. The receipt was still on his desk across the room. Even from a distance, it felt present. He stood, walked back to the study, and picked it up once more. An address, a time, no instructions beyond that. Simple, direct, intentional. He slipped it into his pocket, not as a commitment, just in case. Morning arrived quietly. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, cutting thin lines across the floor. Steven moved through his routine automatically. Shower, coffee, brief glance at his schedule. Meetings filled the afternoon. Calls stacked back to back. His day was structured, controlled, at exactly the time. Written on the receipt, he was supposed to be somewhere else. He stood in front of the mirror for a moment, adjusting his jacket. He could tear the receipt in half right now. No one would know. He would lose nothing tangible. But as he looked at his reflection, the previous day's conversation surfaced again, not as noise, but as clarity. He had built his life on strength. Maybe that wasn't being challenged. Maybe it was being redefined. Steven reached into his pocket and felt the folded paper between his fingers. He didn't sigh. He didn't hesitate. He simply made a decision. Whatever waited at that address, explanation or disappointment, he would face it directly, and with that, he picked up his keys and walked out the door. The address led Steven to a quiet part of town, streets lined with older brick buildings and faded storefronts. Nothing about the location seemed remarkable at first glance. Just another building, ordinary except for the modest sign that read Community Center above the door. He parked his car and paused for a moment. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows across the empty lot. He glanced at the receipt again, double-checking the time. 5 minutes early. Not late. Not rushed. Just on time. He stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of polished floors and faint coffee. Chairs were arranged in a loose circle, some stacked along the walls, others carefully positioned for a gathering. A quiet hum of conversation echoed from one side of the room. Older men, some leaning on canes, some walking slowly with visible effort, were speaking softly to one another. The man from the diner was at the front. He spotted Steven immediately. No surprise, no grand gesture. Just a small, welcoming nod. Steven took a cautious step forward. He had expected an audience to react to him as a celebrity, as someone recognized, someone extraordinary. But no one looked at him that way. Their eyes weren't on him to marvel. Their attention was on the old man, on the circle of men waiting, to hear something, to witness someone who could show up without pretense. The old man gestured toward an empty chair in the circle. "Take a seat," he said softly. "Just as you are." Steven hesitated. His instinct was to stand back, to measure his presence, to maintain some form of distance. But something about the invitation, simple, deliberate, made him move forward. He stepped into the circle, past the rows of chairs, and lowered himself onto one, feeling the floor beneath his feet, the weight of the room around him. The men didn't speak immediately. They watched him for a few moments, not judgmentally, but as one might watch a stranger enter a familiar rhythm and wonder if they could follow along. The old man began. "Gentlemen, this is someone who knows what it means to listen. No applause, no exaggerated introduction. Just a statement. Quiet, confident, observant." Steven realized then that the meeting wasn't about him. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about being present, about showing that he could participate without control, without performance. Stories began to unfold around him. Tales of work lost, bodies weakened, pride challenged, and resilience discovered in the smallest acts. Men shared moments of quiet courage, simple triumphs over daily obstacles, and reflections on what it meant to ask for help. Steven listened. He didn't comment. He didn't offer advice. He simply occupied his seat, letting his presence signal willingness to be part of the group. At one point, the old man leaned slightly toward him and whispered, "It's not about standing alone anymore. It's about knowing when to sit." The circle continued, each story reinforcing a rhythm Steven hadn't expected. Listening, he realized, was active. It required attention, empathy, and the willingness to absorb without judgment. At one moment, one of the men described the frustration of learning to trust again after injury. Steven's chest tightened as he recognized parallels to his own life: control, isolation, and the subtle fear of vulnerability. The old man caught his glance and nodded gently. No words were needed. Time passed differently in that room. Minutes stretched like hours, each story layered on the last, creating an atmosphere of shared understanding. The men didn't need to highlight struggles. The mere act of speaking aloud validated their experiences. By the end of the meeting, Steven felt something unfamiliar. Not pride, not relief, not even admiration. Something quieter, steadier. Connection. He understood that the old man's purpose wasn't to teach him. It wasn't to make him feel inadequate. It was to show, through example, that presence and listening could carry as much weight as action and strength. When the session ended, the men dispersed slowly, greeting one another with small gestures of camaraderie. Steven remained seated for a moment, absorbing the hum of conversation fading into silence. The old man lingered beside him. "You understand now?" he said softly. It wasn't the diner, it wasn't the seat. It was about willingness. Willingness to step in and willingness to step down. Steven nodded. Words felt inadequate. Silence, however, felt appropriate. He stood and extended a hand. The old man grasped it firmly, a final acknowledgement of the shared understanding between them. And in that quiet gesture, everything shifted. The next 24 hours unfolded quietly, but the effect was profound. Steven didn't immediately return to the celebrity life he had stepped away from. He didn't make announcements or schedule interviews about the experience. Instead, he allowed the lessons from the community center to settle within him, subtle and persistent. He woke the following morning with a sense of clarity he hadn't expected. Tasks that once demanded all his attention, meetings, calls, carefully managed schedules, suddenly felt less urgent. The weight of control that usually pressed on him had loosened just slightly, enough to notice. He returned to the community center that day, not because of obligation, but because curiosity had turned into something deeper. The men were already there, forming the familiar circle. Some were moving slowly, others leaning on canes or resting their hands lightly on chairs. The atmosphere wasn't performative. There were no cameras, no agendas. Only presence. Steven took a seat among them. He listened. Not as an outsider, not as someone analyzing behavior, but as one who had something to receive, not just give. He absorbed stories of resilience, small victories, failures that had been endured, and courage that often went unnoticed. Each man spoke without needing to impress, each gesture and tone carrying authenticity. He realized that the simple act of sitting quietly beside others could be transformative. Strength, he understood now, wasn't measured by what you could carry alone. It was measured by your willingness to share space, attention, and understanding with someone else. The old man from the diner spoke last, leaning slightly on his cane. His words weren't loud, but they carried weight. "We are stronger when we recognize the limits of our own strength," he said softly. and braver when we allow ourselves to rely on others, even in small ways. Steven felt a subtle shift in himself. He thought about the walls he had built in his own life, the distance he maintained even from people who cared. He thought about how often he had valued independence over connection, control over compassion. For the first time in years, he saw a path forward where listening mattered as much as acting, where patience and presence could equal courage. He left the community center that afternoon carrying a quiet determination. Meetings could wait, calls could be postponed. The world's expectations weren't as pressing as they had seemed. He wanted to prioritize presence, connection, and attention, things that couldn't be measured on a schedule or a spreadsheet. Walking to his car, he reflected on the old man's words. The simplicity of the act, just sitting, just being present, resonated deeper than he anticipated. What if real strength is knowing when to sit beside someone? That question stayed with him, echoing through the hours that followed. It wasn't a challenge he needed to answer immediately. It wasn't a call to action that demanded dramatic gestures. It was an invitation to pause, to observe, and to engage differently. Even small gestures began to feel significant. He returned phone calls he had delayed for weeks. He spent longer moments with people he often overlooked. He listened, truly listened, without planning responses or protecting appearances. Each interaction, no matter how ordinary, carried meaning. By the evening, the shift had taken hold more tangibly. The quiet of his home felt less like isolation and more like space for reflection. He sat in his favorite chair, considering the last 24 hours. The old man's words had changed his perspective. He understood now that strength was not rigid, not inflexible. It could bend, it could accommodate, and it could support others without diminishing itself. This new understanding didn't make him weaker. It made him fully present in a way he had avoided for years, and that presence, simple, steady, and patient, was the most powerful form of strength he had ever known. By the following afternoon, the effect of the previous day was undeniable. Steven moved through his world differently, subtly, quietly. He didn't announce the change. He didn't tell anyone what had happened. He simply chose to act differently. A phone call he had postponed for weeks was made without hesitation. A conversation he had avoided out of pride was finally addressed. Small gestures, almost imperceptible to others, began to redefine his routine. The shift wasn't dramatic. There were no cameras, no interviews, no recognition. Yet internally, something had changed profoundly. The walls he had built to protect himself and maintain control were no longer absolute. They still existed, but gaps had formed, small openings through which connection could enter. He thought back to the old man's question at the diner, the simple request to sit together. That moment, unremarkable on the surface, had sparked something deeper. It was about more than a seat. It was about presence, attention, and willingness to engage without performance. Steven began to see the ripple effects of that encounter. He approached people with more patience, listened without preparing replies, and allowed vulnerability to exist without rushing to fix it. The shift wasn't instantaneous for everyone he interacted with, but for himself, it was unmistakable. He reflected on the small circle of men at the community center. Their stories, their openness, had shown him that strength doesn't have to be rigid. Courage can be gentle. Authority doesn't need to dominate. Presence and listening can matter as much as action. Even familiar environments felt different. The spaces he occupied, offices, conference rooms, quiet corners, no longer carried the same weight of expectation. He didn't need to perform perfection or project control constantly. He could exist fully in the moment. He remembered the folded receipt the old man had left in the diner. That small, unexplained gesture had been a turning point. It led him to witness honesty and vulnerability, not as weaknesses but as forms of quiet strength. Later, as he returned home, he paused at the kitchen table. He considered the shift in himself. Gratitude replaced skepticism. Reflection replaced analysis. Connection replaced isolation. The change was simple but profound. He no longer saw the elderly man or anyone else seeking company or understanding as fragile or secondary. He saw intention. He saw courage. He saw humanity. The smallest acts, a shared conversation, a quiet moment of listening, an offered seat, had revealed a truth he had long overlooked. Steven understood now. Everything he thought defined strength was only part of it. The real measure lay in presence, in attentiveness, in the willingness to share space with someone else without judgment. And in that understanding, a shift occurred that would ripple through the decisions he made, the relationships he nurtured, and the life he would lead going forward. How often do we miss the moments that quietly change everything? The next time Steven returned to the diner, he chose the same corner booth. Sunlight filtered through the windows, scattering across the table and floor. He arrived early, waiting, not knowing exactly what to expect, but certain that something important would unfold. The elderly man appeared, slower this time, the weight of years evident in each careful step. A faint smile crossed his face as he spotted Steven. There was no hesitation this time, no uncertainty. Steven gestured to the seat across from him. The old man nodded and lowered himself carefully into the booth. No words were exchanged at first. The silence was comfortable, reflective, and full of unspoken understanding. They didn't need to recount the events of the past day. The shared experience had shifted something deeper. The space between them was no longer empty. It was filled with recognition, mutual respect, and the quiet acknowledgement of connection. Steven realized that not every encounter needed to be dramatic to be meaningful. Some moments settle into life softly, teaching lessons that ripple far beyond the immediate scene. Strength could be gentle, courage could be quiet, and the simplest gestures, a shared seat, attentive listening, patient presence, could carry more weight than grand actions or heroic statements. The elderly man spoke softly, not to instruct, but to observe. His words weren't loud, but they carried intention. Steven listened, understanding that the lesson was less about guidance and more about shared humanity. In that moment, it was clear. Some people arrive in your life not to demand attention or admiration, but to remind you of what matters, not the noise, not the recognition, not the performance, but the quiet acts that shape perspective and deepen understanding. Steven leaned back, taking in the light, the man's calm presence, and the hum of the diner around them. Gratitude replaced control. Connection replaced distance. Reflection replaced urgency. If a stranger asked to sit at your table today, would you see interruption or invitation? The question hung in the air like the sunlight across the booth. It wasn't rhetorical. It wasn't about politeness or etiquette. It was about perspective, about willingness to pause, to engage, to open space for someone else. And sometimes Steven realized the people who appear weakest are the ones strong enough to remind you what truly matters.